The Vietnam War was one of the most complex and controversial conflicts of the 20th century. It was not a war that started suddenly, nor was it fought for a single clear reason. Instead, it grew slowly out of decades of political struggle, foreign control, and global fear. For many people, Vietnam became a symbol of suffering, resistance, and misunderstanding. To truly understand why the Vietnam War broke out, we must look beyond the battlefield and explore the history, ideologies, and decisions that shaped it. This war was deeply connected to colonialism, nationalism, and the Cold War, making it far more than just a regional conflict. Before the war, Vietnam was under French colonial rule for nearly a century. France controlled Vietnam as part of French Indochina, exploiting its resources and people for economic gain. Vietnamese citizens had little political power and were heavily taxed. Their culture and traditions were often ignored or suppressed. Over time, resentment grew among the population, especially among farmers and workers who suffered the most. Nationalist movements slowly formed, demanding independence and self-rule. This long period of colonial oppression planted the first seeds of conflict, making resistance not only likely, but inevitable for the Vietnamese people. During World War II, the situation in Vietnam changed dramatically. Japan occupied Vietnam after defeating French forces, weakening French authority even further. This chaos allowed Vietnamese resistance groups to organize more effectively. One such group was the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. He combined nationalism with communist ideology, believing that communism could unite the people and free Vietnam from foreign control. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a power vacuum emerged. Ho Chi Minh seized the moment and declared Vietnam's independence, hoping the world would recognize his new nation and respect Vietnam's right to self-determination. However, Vietnam's declaration of independence was not accepted by France. Determined to regain control, France sent troops back to Vietnam, triggering the First Indochina War. This conflict lasted for nearly 8 years and was extremely brutal. The Vietnamese forces relied on guerrilla warfare, local support, and determination, while the French used superior weapons and military training. Despite France's power, the Vietnamese fighters slowly gained ground. The war finally ended in 1954 when the French suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, shocking the world and ending French colonial rule in Vietnam. After France's defeat, international leaders gathered at the Geneva Conference to decide Vietnam's future. The result was a temporary division of the country along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam became a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh, while South Vietnam was established as an anti-communist government supported by the United States. Elections were planned to reunify the country, but they never happened. The United States feared that Ho Chi Minh would win easily. This decision to cancel elections turned a temporary division into a permanent source of tension and conflict. The Cold War played a critical role in turning Vietnam into a battlefield. The world was divided between two powerful blocs, the Communist East, led by the Soviet Union and China, and the capitalist West, led by the United States. Each side feared the expansion of the other's ideology. The U.S. believed in the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, nearby countries would follow. Vietnam was seen as a crucial test. Preventing communism in Vietnam became a priority for the United States, even though the conflict was deeply rooted in local history and nationalism. South Vietnam's government struggled from the beginning. It was widely viewed as corrupt, authoritarian, and disconnected from ordinary citizens. Many people in rural areas felt ignored and mistreated. This dissatisfaction created an opportunity for communist supporters in the South, known as the Viet Cong. With backing from North Vietnam, they launched an insurgency against the South Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, blending into villages and jungles. Their ability to gain local support made them extremely difficult to defeat, further destabilizing the region and drawing increasing attention from the United States. At first, the United States did not send large numbers of troops. Instead, it provided military advisors, funding, and equipment to South Vietnam. American leaders believed this limited involvement would be enough to stop communism. However, as the situation worsened, pressure grew to take stronger action. U.S. officials feared that losing Vietnam would damage America's global reputation. Each year, involvement increased slightly, creating a slow but steady path toward full-scale war. What began as support soon turned into direct military intervention, marking a turning point in the conflict. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 became the official justification for major U.S. involvement. The U.S. government claimed that American naval ships were attacked by North Vietnamese forces. Although the details were unclear, the incident led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave the president broad powers to use military force without declaring war. Soon after, thousands of American troops were sent to Vietnam. Airstrikes intensified, and the conflict expanded rapidly. Vietnam was no longer a regional struggle. It had become a full-scale international war. American soldiers entered a battlefield unlike anything they had experienced before. Dense jungles, hidden tunnels, and unfamiliar terrain made combat extremely challenging. The Viet Cong avoided direct confrontation and relied on ambushes, traps, and surprise attacks. Despite advanced technology, the U.S. military struggled to identify the enemy. Civilians were often caught in the middle, suffering enormous losses. Bombing campaigns and chemical weapons caused long-term environmental damage. The war became increasingly destructive, yet progress remained unclear, raising serious questions about strategy and purpose. As the war continued, public opinion in the United States began to shift. Graphic media coverage brought images of violence and suffering into people's homes. Many Americans started questioning why their country was fighting in Vietnam. Protests erupted across universities and cities. Soldiers returning home shared stories of confusion and trauma. The gap between government statements and reality on the ground created widespread distrust. Vietnam was no longer seen as a noble cause by many, but as a costly and unnecessary war that lacked clear objectives and achievable goals. Meanwhile, North Vietnam remained determined. They believed they were fighting a war of national liberation, not foreign aggression. Despite heavy bombing and massive casualties, their resolve did not weaken. Support from China and the Soviet Union helped sustain their war effort. The Vietnamese population endured immense hardship but continued resisting. This contrast between American military power and Vietnamese determination revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. The U.S. underestimated the strength of nationalism and overestimated the effectiveness of military force in shaping political outcomes. The Tet Offensive in 1968 marked a major psychological turning point. Although it was a military setback for North Vietnam, it shocked the American public. Coordinated attacks across South Vietnam showed that the enemy was far from defeated. Confidence in official claims collapsed. Many began to see the war as unwinnable. Political pressure increased, forcing U.S. leaders to reconsider their strategy. Vietnam had become a symbol of limits of power, control, and understanding in a deeply complex conflict. Efforts to end the war slowly gained momentum. Peace talks began, but progress was slow and difficult. Fighting continued while negotiations dragged on. Both sides suffered enormous losses. In the United States, opposition to the war grew stronger. Leaders faced increasing pressure to withdraw troops. The war was draining resources, dividing society, and damaging international reputation. Vietnam was no longer just a foreign conflict, it had become a national crisis that affected politics, culture, and trust in leadership. In 1973, the United States officially withdrew its combat troops following peace agreements. However, the fighting in Vietnam did not stop. Without U.S. military support, South Vietnam struggled to survive. 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The images of helicopters evacuating people from rooftops became lasting symbols of the war's end. For many, it represented not just defeat, but the cost of misunderstanding history and culture. The human cost of the Vietnam War was devastating. Millions of Vietnamese civilians lost their lives. Entire villages were destroyed. Generations were affected by trauma, poverty, and environmental damage. More than 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and many returned home physically and emotionally scarred. The war left wounds that lasted decades. Its impact extended far beyond Vietnam, influencing global politics and shaping how future conflicts were viewed and fought. Vietnam also changed how wars were reported and remembered. Media coverage played a powerful role in shaping public opinion. For the first time, people saw the realities of war in near real time. This transparency challenged official narratives and exposed contradictions. Governments could no longer control the story as easily. Vietnam became a lesson in accountability, showing how information could influence policy and public trust. The Vietnam War forced the world to confront difficult questions. Can military power solve political problems? Should foreign nations decide another country's future? What happens when fear overrides understanding? These questions remain relevant today. Vietnam demonstrated that ideology-driven conflicts often ignore human realities. It showed the danger of oversimplifying complex societies and histories into political theories. So, why did the Vietnam War break out? It happened because colonialism created resistance, the Cold War created fear, and political leaders made choices without fully understanding the people involved. Vietnam became a stage for global rivalry, even though its people primarily wanted independence. The war was not inevitable, but it became unavoidable once diplomacy failed and force replaced dialogue. The Vietnam War stands as a powerful reminder of history's consequences. It teaches us that wars are rarely about one reason or one moment. They grow from years of tension, mistakes, and missed opportunities. Understanding Vietnam means understanding the cost of ignoring history and humanity. As the world continues to face conflicts, the lessons of Vietnam remain more important than ever. A warning written not in words, but in lives.